for staying with us on the World Now. In a historical declaration, G20 leaders commit to taxing billionaires, tackling inequalities, and taking climate action. The declaration addresses social inclusion, the fight against hunger and poverty, the taxation of billionaires, measures for the energy transition, the global governance reform, and the acceleration of climate action, while also supporting COP30. We'll have details in this report.
The document, which achieved consensus among all member countries, reinforces the group's commitment to addressing global challenges and promoting strong, sustainable, and inclusive growth. Within the declaration, leaders reaffirmed their dedication to crucial issues that shape the global future. Leaders emphasized the importance of coordinated actions to combat climate change, promote just energy transitions, and preserve the environment. They also stressed the need for comprehensive reform in global governance, including strengthening the United Nations, modernizing the international financial system, fostering an inclusive multilateral trading system, and promoting the ethical development of artificial intelligence.
Índia, Brasil e agora África do Sul trazem à mesa perspectivas que interessam a vasta maioria da população mundial.
Earlier at a Sustainable Development and Energy Transition, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, told G20 leaders that the climate is at a breaking point. The Secretary-General noted that the next round of national climate action plans is essential to putting the world on the right path. In relation to COP29, he asked countries to instruct ministers and negotiators to agree on a new ambitious climate finance goal this year.
Unless we limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, spiraling disasters will devastate every economy. And current policies would take us over 3 degrees, and that means catastrophe. We must get on track for the 1.5 degree limit, with countries accelerating their near-term emissions cuts so that we can reduce global emissions by 9% every year this decade. So we must speed up the just transition from fossil fuels to renewables. They are now the cheapest source of new electricity virtually everywhere.
The 2024 summit's theme is Building a Just World and a Sustainable Planet. It was attended by 19 member countries, plus the African Union and the EU.
And political commentator Nathaniel Oguniyi joins me from the UK. Good to have you join us. So I just want to get your overall view of the G20 summit and what you make of the conversation there.
So when looking at the summit, I think it's important to note two things. One, that two of the most influential people currently in the world were not actually there. So you have Donald Trump, who's just been re-elected and a landslide victory in the United States. He doesn't take office until January, and so he didn't attend this G20 summit. You have Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, who is obviously involved in the war in Ukraine. And so those are two of the most influential people in the world, but they weren't actually at this summit. And so that limits the extent to which you can have impact in any of these conversations. I suppose that the second thing to note is that there was some progress on global reform around the UN Security Council, but I think there has been a lack of concrete agreements. There's been a lot of warm words, there's been a lot of consensus, but you haven't had people coming out and making legally binding commitments to act in certain ways or to refrain from doing other things.
And interesting, you mentioned President-elect Donald Trump. Did you get the sense that the leaders were trying to sort of shore up some kind of multilateral consensus before U.S. President Donald Trump, President-elect rather Donald Trump, returns to power in January?
Yes, so it is prudent as leader to prepare for any change in circumstance. You see that over in the UK, we have Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and he and the top team within government have been doing a lot of work on how the UK's position changes with the election of Donald Trump, and when he comes into office, what policies we will have to change and how we can work most effectively with him. Equally, it is important to note that there are often distinctions between the rhetoric that Donald Trump may make and the actual underlying policy. One thing I think that we learned from the first Trump presidency is that his rhetoric, his feelings, the comments he makes on Twitter don't always come true in policy terms. And the policy timelines can be slow. Sometimes you announce something and then it gets sent to the Supreme Court and it's held up in all kinds of legal challenges, and that takes time.
And interesting, because it sort of seems that on every global issue at the moment, and most global issue, whether the Russian-Ukraine war, the war in Israel, climate change, we see COP29 ongoing in Baku, Azerbaijan, that leaders are walking on a thin line because Donald Trump could resume office on January 20th next year and undo some of these decisions, withdraw the U.S. from some of these treaties and agreements. I mean, do you also get that sense?
Yes, I think when Donald Trump says America first, he means it. And you see that he is not afraid to remove the US from a lot of international treaties. Some of those can be done by executive order, so they don't require congressional approval. Others of them, where there are international agreements and then laws have been passed to enforce those agreements, require the approval of Congress. And so it may take a bit longer to do that. But I think when it comes to that, Donald Trump means it. And you look at the way the US participates in some other international bodies, it's clear to see that actually they are happy to leave or indeed make threats to leave if they don't feel like their needs are being met.
And let's talk about something historic that happened at the G20 summit. The baton has now been handed over to South Africa. South Africa will become the very first African country to host the summit. What does this say about Africa's positioning now on the global order?
Yes, so this the 2025 summit will be hosted in South Africa, the first time it's coming to Africa. I think the decision to host it in South Africa represents the changing landscape that we have when it comes to international politics. But fundamentally, the biggest bodies in international politics remain the same. So we've had lots of talk about UN Security Council reform, adding an African or another Asian representative to the permanent members. We've seen all kinds of talk about that, but we haven't seen meaningful measures or meaningful agreement on changes. And so while it may be nice to have the summit in Africa, what does that actually mean in terms of African representation at the UN Security Council or in other bodies? What does that actually mean for the African economies? What does that actually mean for defense and security on the continent? I think that's less clear. It's nice to have these things and it's nice to host these things, but they don't change the fundamental realities of global power.
Interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your analysis. Political commentator Nathaniel Oguni.